Good afternoon, everyone. We'd like to welcome you to the Geco reunion of 2002. My name is Michael Stanley.
My name is Tracy Stanley. I am daughter of former Geco 8 Warren Evans, whom some of you knew only as Corky during your Geco days, as my father has already mentioned. The name Geco is an acronym for the General Engineering Company, a large and thriving corporation based in Salt Lake City, Utah in the 1930s. So then, how did an American firm come to be associated with this remote area of Scarborough, Ontario, Canada? For the answer to this, we must allow our minds to travel back in time to England, 1940, during the very early and bleak days of World War II. Hitler and his mob had already blitzkrieged through Denmark, Norway, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, and Belgium. Then France, the one country deemed capable of stopping the Germans in their tracks, was totally defeated in May-June of 1940. France could now be used as a stepping stone to invade Great Britain. As a softening up procedure in preparation for a planned invasion by land, Germany assaulted England, especially London, with devastating around-the-clock bombing raids. But the Germans underestimated the morale and steadfastness of the British nation, particularly under the gritty leadership of Britain's new Prime Minister, Winston Churchill. In itself, however, high morale and gritty leadership were puny weapons at best against the overwhelming military might of the equally determined German nation. More than anything else in those initial stages of war, the Brits needed a continuous and uninterrupted supply of all manner of arms. The growing frequency of air raids, and necessary blackout conditions constantly interrupted and slowed the manufacture of desperately needed arms and munitions. England was in deep trouble. In one of his famous speeches, Winston Churchill made an urgent plea for tools of war. At that time, the United States was still a neutral nation. Nevertheless, the U.S. Congress immediately approved aid in the form of a Lend-Lease program. In no time flat, disguised merchant ships left out from a quiet bay in the state of New Jersey to begin the hazardous return trip to the arsenals of the British Isles. Of course, England's Commonwealth countries, Australia, New Zealand, and Canada responded in kind. The Canadian government, under Prime Minister William Lyon Mackenzie King, offered to construct 2 new major munitions plants and to begin shipping as soon as possible vast caches of ready-to-fire arms to the Allies in war-torn Europe. Apart from its armed forces, which were already fighting overseas, there was no greater and significant contribution Canada could have made. The first plant would be built on a particular site in Bouchard in the province of Quebec. Construction began at once. The second, more complex and larger plant was yet to begin. This plant, proposed to be of unprecedented production in Canada when in full operation, would be built somewhere in the proximity to the city of Toronto to draw on its labor force. On December 10, 1940, the quest for a suitable site began in earnest. Government scouts scoured thousands of prime acres of countryside in the outskirts east, west, and north of Toronto. Meanwhile, the government hired a reputable American-based company, General Engineering, to undertake this momentous task of constructing the Dominion's most major shell-filling plant. Engineers and company heads Robert Hamilton and his younger brother Peter would oversee the construction and subsequent operation of the plant. Until a suitable site was found, they busied themselves consulting with some of America's foremost ordnance experts in an effort to correlate the best shell-filling plant designs as used in Great Britain with those of the United States. The Hamilton brothers knew that as soon as a site was found, they had to be ready to start construction in a moment's notice. Time was not altogether on anybody's side during those early and bloody days of World War II. It could not be frittered away. At the beginning of January 1941, government scouts finally located a suitable site in Scarborough Township, near the eastern limits of Toronto. Unanimously, all parties involved saw it as ideal. Transmission lines of the Hydroelectric Power Commission were conveniently nearby, and Canadian National Railways could feasibly run short spur lines into the property. Acting on behalf of the Crown, the Real Estate Department of Allied War Supplies Corporation at once undertook expropriation of the required property. Before the end of January 41, His Majesty the King and Right of Canada acquired the site from 7 different proprietors in the area. In its final form, it consisted of 358 acres, extending 4,500 feet south from existing Eglinton Avenue and bounded on the east by Birchmount Road and on the west by Warden Avenue, a wraparound, enterprising and long-standing farm area. By this time, the General Engineering Company, with brothers Robert and Peter Hamilton at the helm, had done its own homework, also in record time, and was poised for action. Technically complex blueprints, barely dry with ink, were ready to be doled out to the various trades in the field. And yet, the war raged on in Europe. There was no time to lose. On February 6, 1941, the first fleet of bulldozers and other heavy earth-moving machines pushed their blades and buckets into the frozen and barren field. To assist, the project engineers made the decision to begin blasting the frozen ground with dynamite. Daily, and in all sections of the 358 acres, tall plumes of earth hurtled into the frigid air. By the beginning of March, floodlights were set up and around-the-clock shift work began. Due to war conditions, non-availability or delayed delivery of construction materials resulted in snap decisions being made for such changes and innovations as no window construction for the filling shops and construction of laminated wooden beams instead of steel. If we look above our heads, we will see these laminated wooden beams because this Emperor's Banquet Hall, in which we have gathered today, is one of the original historical Geco buildings. All necessary improvisations were made on the spot. Construction progress peaked in the month of June 41 at an average wage of 80 cents per hour, and in the final run, a total of 2 million man-hours would be required to complete the project. Geco was 100% completed by the beginning of December 41. The total expenditure for labor, machinery, equipment, buildings, and so on was $7,182,000. A lot of money in 1941. The complex was comprised of 172 buildings with an overall floor area of 790,000 square feet. The buildings were connected by a series of galleries raised 2 feet above the ground and having a combined length of 16,000 feet through which workers could move and munitions quickly carted. Not visible from any possible overhead enemy aircraft was a vast labyrinth of underground tunnels with a total linear length of 14,000 feet. Now, for the metric-minded among us, which includes me, that's close to 5 kilometers of tunnel, one slice of which runs through the entire length of this former Geco building, right under our feet. My brother Dean, his wife Maureen, Michael, and I have recently been down in this section of tunnels, and we were very impressed. They are very big. Eventually, up to 6,000 employees, mostly young women, were fingerprinted, photographed, and assigned to a wide variety of duties. Work began on a 24-hour non-stop rotating shift basis. Tons of all manner of shells, fuses, and tracers were assembled and loaded with highly combustible powders to be sure a potentially very dangerous operation. They were then hastily crated and shipped on their way to the front lines in war-ravaged Europe. But Geco was more than just a place for wartime employment for the Allied cause. It had been designed, built, and would be operated as a mini-city. The administration building, also known as Building 1, housed the main switchboard for the complex, which at its peak had 13 trunk lines and 240 local numbers, and with a volume of calls averaging 50,000 per week. One of the largest buildings was set up for use as the company's cafeteria, called the canteen. In no time, they were serving an average of 1,000 meals per half hour, and at its peak, it would reach a demand of 65,000 meals per month. It was an operation unto itself. Building 86 became Geco's new medical building, complete with an ambulance, 5 full-time physicians, and 12 nurses. Any injuries, illnesses, and so on would be attended to on the site. Like the canteen, they too must have been very busy, with up to 1,500 visits made by alien employees each week. Because this huge and new shell filling plant was physically separated from Toronto proper and deemed out in the sticks, many unusual amenities were in place for the employees. For example, monthly dances were held chiefly in the canteen, with an average attendance of between 800 to 1,000 persons. Across Eglinton Avenue, in the empty fields north of the complex, Victory Gardens were set up for the exclusive and free use of Geco's employees. In that first full summer of operation in 1942, no less than 510 Green Thumb employees availed themselves of this company-offered, very unique diversion. Plant picnics also became very popular, with turnouts averaging 500 employees and their families. Feelings of camaraderie were at their highest during such happy get-togethers. But these folk were not working on shifts just to make ends meet. They had another motive, a war to win, the biggest war in the history of mankind. Battles raged on in Europe. From the daily news reports in all of the major newspapers, Canadians were given no reason to be optimistic for an early end to war. Losses on both sides, Axis and Allies, were now numbering in the hundreds of thousands. To be sure, Geco was doing its fair share for the war effort. Production on a 24-hour basis never slowed or slacked. It was a gigantic effort by variable hordes of dedicated workers. It was full steam ahead. Daily, by rail or by road to waiting ships, thousands of ready-to-fire shells were on their way to Europe. The workers had all the incentive they needed, because to contemplate the German Empire eventually invading the shores of Canada was a frightening prospect indeed, and never a remote possibility in mid-1943. For the remainder of that year and into the next, plant production at Geco was at an all-time high. Slowly, over the next 2 years, the Allied victories outnumbered those of the Axis powers. The once seemingly invincible might of the German Empire had withered to an unrecoverable point. On May 7, 1945, Nazi Germany unconditionally surrendered. The European phase of World War II had come to an end. With this most welcome news, production, which had remained constant until that final day, ceased at once and forever at the Geco plant. The need for arms and weapons of destruction were gone. A Canadian wartime legacy in rural Scarborough, Ontario ended. But I should mention at this point that plant production had been interrupted only once, and then only by the whim of Mother Nature. On December 12, 1944, a record amount of snow fell in most regions of southern Ontario. My father, Warren, a young boy living in the area of High Park at that time, vividly remembers this storm as many others here will. And he believes that this record snowfall still stands today. It virtually shut down the city of Toronto. The entire Geco plant became hopelessly snowbound, and 1,500 employees were unable to return to their homes in the city, and the ship to follow was unable to leave the city. That evening, and only that one time, there was more whooping it up than work performed at the Geco plant. On July 31st, 45, the last issue of Geco's magazine, called the Geco Facilier, was distributed to the employees. An article under the heading 30, the newspaper symbol for the end, read as follows.